The World Championship of Magic just concluded this past weekend with Javier Dominguez becoming a two-time world champion. So not only are we going to have Fervent Champion, but we're going to get another Javier-esque card in our repertoire in the coming years of Magic the Gathering. Congratulations to Javier, and the rest of Worlds did bring a lot of different things to the world of Magic, but the one that I'm going to be focusing on most in this video is how it affected the standard environment, since we do have multiple standard RCQ seasons up and coming throughout the next competitive season of 2025-2026, in addition to the fact that we have foundations and a bunch of new sets coming up. So I want to wind up going over what happened at the Magic Worlds tournament, what standard decks kind of piqued our interest and piqued the top of that very small meta game, and what you could be looking to build yourself as we go into the holiday season and start gearing up for standard RCQs at your own LGS. Now, before we wind up recapping any sort of metagame analysis, I of course have to give the caveat to the numbers. As always, the good people at Melee GG have provided all of the information that I am gathering for this tournament here, with 113 registered players for Worlds. Now, there are 113 registered deck lists, so no one's going to be missing any sort of information as it goes for as far as deck lists go, or their names or archetypes or whatever. Now, there have been a split between the draft and the standard portion of the tournament, and for this analysis, I'm only going to be using standard win rates, so even though somebody may have a certain amount of wins on the Melee GG website or on the Magic GG website for their overall record, we are only looking at standard results because we don't want to assign wins to decks that actually didn't play those games. Speaking of the decks, I did break out the sort of analysis on the decks a little bit more than Frank Karsten or Magic GG or even Melee GG wound up having. Mostly the kind of definition between the normal Dimir Demons list and then the team Handshake version, which played out a little bit differently and was the one that Javier actually wound up winning the tournament with. So you can see in my metagame analysis that things will be broken down just a teeny tiny bit more. And then of course, as another caveat, this is a very small event with a very elite core of players that have been invited into it. Only half the event was the standard portion of things. So while there are going to be numbers, and I am going to be doing full analysis on this, there isn't going to be as conclusive of a takeaway that we can, or as conducive of a takeaway that we can get for a big, grand, standard overall picture. Instead, I would use this information to inform your choices of what you may want to play at Store Championships or your LGS, or start buying cards to prepare towards, as a lot of these decks have a very core few cards I'm going to highlight, versus being the top deck that's going to stay there until the RCQ season begins. Since this was a little bit of a smaller tournament and it had an elite group of players, instead of doing my normal analysis where I go over the breakdown of the decks in the room, the metagame, the top winning decks, etc., there were a small enough number of decks where what I'm going to be doing is doing the normal metagame breakdown of what we saw and how many we saw of it and how they performed, but I'm also going to be doing a quick little highlight on every single archetype, very similar to the way that I highlighted some of the breakout archetypes in my last regional championship video for Pioneer. So if you like that style, you can see how I did it there, and we're going to do a quick breakdown of those in this video as well. And of course, I'm going to wind up doing a breakdown of the top tier presence decks that were at Worlds. And again, because there was a small sample size in this, I've expanded it to 11 to encompass everything that had at least 3 or more decks in the room. And that will be highlighted the normal way I go about my analysis. So, as I just said, let's kick it off by taking a look at what decks were played at Magic Worlds and which decks wound up coming out better for their metagame presence. As you can see, Gruul Prowess was the most played deck in the room with 20 copies for a 17.7% share of the metagame. Meanwhile, Dimir Midrange, which was very much so having some demons but missing the key parts to the demon package we'll go over later, was the second most represented archetype at 14.2%. The Azorius Oculus deck, which was sort of a breakout deck for the tournament and something has been gaining popularity in multiple formats, tied with the Domain Ramp at 11.5% of the metagame share. the Golgari Midrange deck, which was different than Channel Fireball's Golgari Ramp deck, also tied with the Temur Prowess or Temur Otters deck that Sanctum of All put together at 8% of the metagame, while Team Handshake's Demons deck and the Jeskai version of the Convoke deck, which was originally Boros but is splashing for a couple of blue cards now, shared at 5.3% of the metagame. Now, that aforementioned Channel Fireball list in Golgari Ramp had 5 decks present at 4.4% of the metagame, while the Dimir Demons list, which was the kind of more stock standard version, and the mono white Caretaker's Talent decks had 3 representatives in the room at 2.7% of the field each. The rest of the decks in the room had 2 or less, including Boros Auras style decks, the Orzhov Demons deck, which was a white twist on the Dimir and some other styles of deck that we had seen previously, a very powerful mono Red Aggro deck, a Gruul Delirium deck, which Aspiring Spike has made very popular in other formats, a Golgari twist on the Demons deck, because go figure, the Demons seem very powerful, an Azorius spin on the Caretaker Talent deck, a Sultai Reanimator deck, and a slightly different version of mono red utilizing mostly prowess creatures over just burn and turning things sideways. Now, before we jump into each individual deck and seeing how it performed and sort of some of the key cards that made it tick, I do want to address my popularity tier ranking again, which is something that I've kind of amalgamated from some of the older, more written articles that I've done previously in my Magic content, as well as just something that I've been able to do at larger events like the Regional Championship to kind of see not only how powerful a deck was, but how popular it was and how many copies you can kind of expect to see at your own LGS or smaller tournament as well. Now, these popularity tiers are basically mathematically looking at a histogram of all the decks in the room, figuring out on average how many copies were there, and then seeing how many standard deviations away from the mean that they were. So if there were the most popular decks in the room and had a huge amount of presence of the decks, that is going to be the S tier. Whereas on the flip side, if they were below average representation, I have just put them down there as D tier, regardless of how far below the average they've actually gone, kind of group them all together that way. Now, for a smaller event like this, the concentration of decks is going to be a little bit smaller. There are only 113 players at this event, so that does mean that we're probably not going to wind up having an S tier because there just wasn't one deck that completely took over the room. Starting off with the most played deck in the room, Gruul Prowess is a Gruul twist on an aggro deck, mostly utilizing Slickshot, Show Off, and Crew, and the core red cards that we've seen played across a couple of formats, including Pioneer most recently. It uses Slickshot, Show Off in addition to the mouse package of Heartfire Hero, Emberheart Challenger, and in standard Manifold Mouse to try to really dish out the pain on somebody as quickly as possible. Now, we don't have the fling component that we do in the Rakdos version of Pioneer, but the same amount of pump spells and some direct damage are still available in this list, while it looks to utilize Innkeeper's Talent to keep its creatures large and protected for long enough to close out the game. Now, the Gruul Prowess deck did have the largest metagame share at 17.7%, meaning it was the only A-tier popularity deck in the room, and it still wound up having a solid 52.5% win rate at the tournament. Now, granted, this is a smaller event, so there were less matches overall, but being the top deck in the room as far as number goes and an above 50% win rate is a pretty solid place to be in any sort of metagame. Dimir Midrange was taking the old black X package that we saw in previous standard or games and kind of iterating on it with a twist of some additional new cards. Now, the core of Deep Cavern Bat, Spyglass Siren, and Fairy Mastermind was relatively unchanged, but we did wind up having copies of Unstoppable Slasher and Enduring Curiosity make the list of creatures in this black-blue mid-range deck. The addition of Kaito, Bane of Nightmares, which is a creature on your turn with hexproof, as well as just being a very powerful, versatile planeswalker, made this deck a little bit more oomphy than its older standard versions that were a little bit more about flash threats and chip damage. Now, the Dimir Midrange deck had 16 copies in the room for 14.2% of the metagame share, which made it just under the Gruul Prowess deck at B tier in popularity, while it sported a slightly higher win rate at 53.0% win rate overall, in addition to putting 2 copies into the top 8. The Azorius Oculus deck, or Azorius Unearthed Reanimator style package, was another deck that took something that existed in older version of Standard and iterated on it with newer cards. Now the core of Haughty Djinn, Picklock Prankster, and a bunch of spells to make a very large Djinn is relatively unchanged, in addition to copies of Charter Cores to have a decent amount of card draw. However, the discard part of that now became a boon rather than a burden, thanks to running Helping Hand and Recommission to reanimate your 3-mana threats like Haughty Djinn, and the recently printed Abhorrent Oculus, which played a very good young Pyromancer style gameplay, being able to manifest dread on your opponent's upkeep, which meant you can feel your own graveyard, put your best card face down as a 2/2, and if it is another copy of one of your powerful creatures, you can just flip it up at any point in time. So this Azorius Oculus deck did have 13 copies in the room, which gave it a B tier of popularity, and had a very high overall win rate at 56.3%, despite all the copies that we wound up seeing in the room. Even though it didn't wind up making top 8, this is definitely going to be a deck that to look out for and potentially make you run some graveyard hate. Another deck that was in previous Standard that got some updates with Duskmourn specifically is the Domain Ramp package, and while the Azorius Oculus deck was new and had a high win rate, the Domain Ramp list was not as great. It had a 41.1% win rate despite having just as many copies of Oculus in the room, giving it a B tier in popularity, which is one of the lowest win rates based on how many decks you actually had at the event. Now, even though this deck got a big upgrade with Overlord of the Hauntwoods, giving you an everywhere land, which instantly gives you access to Domain, the core of Up the Beanstalk, Leyline Binding, and some temporary lockdowns in order to kind of put the tempo down on the aggro decks wasn't that great against a bunch of 3 mana or higher creatures like Oculus, Haughty Djinn, and then some that the decks were packing out of Standard this time around. Golgari Midrange was one of 2 different green-black decks that cracked the top 8, but this one was just a little bit more of your standard fair deck. Now, it did still utilize a powerful package of Caustic Bronco, Archfiend of the Dross, and Mosswood Dread Knight that existed in the last iteration of this deck, as well as relying on Glissa Sunslayer to kind of fill its curve, but the addition of Unholy Annex, Ritual Chamber as a room to give it some extra card advantage and reach was a big power-up overall. Even though the deck wound up getting second in the hands of Marcio Carvalho, it did not wind up having a positive win rate overall for the tournament, with 8% of the metagame, a 49.2% win rate, and a solid C tier popularity pick. The mid-range deck might not be in the best spot going forward. Evoking memories of older Standard combo-centric and specifically token-centric decks, the Temur Otters, or Dimir Prowess deck brought by Team Sanctum of All, did a lot of things that were just seemingly unfair. In general, this kind of relied on the synergy between Valley Floodcaller and Enduring Vitality. Now, in general, with both of these creatures out, you can tap Valley Floodcaller for mana, cast a non-creature spell, untap it, and then do that over and over again. So you wind up making as many birds, frogs, otters, and rats as possible, mostly otters and rats in this deck, thanks to Stormchaser's talent, Thundertrap Trainer, and Song of Totentans, and able to just basically make as many creatures as possible, untap them, make a bunch of mana, and then go a little infinite if you so would be inclined to compare this to Jeskai Ascendancy, utilizing Up the Beanstalk, Stormchaser's talent, and This Town Ain't Big Enough. So you could bounce your own 2 enchantments, replay them, tick up with your infinite amount of mana to level up your class and get This Town Ain't Big Enough back, and then make infinitely large creatures, infinite amount of spells, all this kind of good stuff that just makes it a very difficult deck to interact with once it gets going. However, the deck does have to get going, and despite having a very solid game plan with 8% of the players in the room playing it, only 47.1% was the win rate for this C-tier popularity combo deck. One of the two Dimir Demons lists, known as the Handshake Demons, thanks to Team Handshake and tournament winner Javier Dominguez piloting this list, took the core package of Demons Matter cards that we've seen in Pioneer and Standard kind of taking over in Unholy Annex, Archfiend of the Dross, and other sorts of demons, and added in a bit of a combo kill to it. Doomsday Excruciator will wind up making both players have only 6 cards in their library, while Jace the Perfected Mind, a planeswalker that's been floating around in Standard for a little while and was popular in the old Slogurk decks, will be able to mill them out if the Doomsday Excruciator ever lands. Now, if you don't have the Jace and are able to resolve it, Restless Reef will also mill your opponent for 4 cards when it attacks, so if you're able to get them down low enough, they will be facing extinction from this demon-centric combo, not to mention the fact that the Unholy Annexes will be drawing you cards and draining your opponent the entire time as well. Now, this was one of the better of the two demons lists in the Dimir colors, having a 51.4% win rate and a C-tier popularity, as only 6 copies were floating around the room. The Jeskai version of the Convoke decks wound up taking some of the blue splash in what we saw towards the end of last Standard season and just kind of sticking to it. We had the Spyglass Siren as the main reason to be running blue, but also recently got Mockingbird from Bloomburrow to enter the battlefield as a copy of something important like a Warden of the Inner Sky for just 1 mana, or an Imidane's Recruiter or something a little bit bigger if we needed it. We still had the Convoke angle to the Boros shell of Knight Errant of Eos, trying to get that one out on turn 2 as much as possible to be able to restock your hand and go wide for a very fast kill, while the deck also got Clockwork Percussionist as a way to give it a little bit of extra reach and some card advantage. Sheltered by Ghosts was also run in some of the lists as a removal spell that synergized perfect with your aggro turn things sideways plan. Now, this deck had a fair 50% win rate overall with a 5.3% metagame share, so the same amount as the Team Handshake Demons list, giving it a C-tier popularity, being even 50% win rate across the board, and being one of the more go-wide aggro strategies that didn't get as punished by the lack of temporary lockdown decks in the room. The second flavor of Golgari that wound up cracking the top 8 of the tournament was Channel Fireball's Golgari Ramp Shell. Now, very similar to the Golgari Midrange in a bunch of different cards, it did have a few key differences, most specifically running up the Beanstalk, Overlord of the Hauntwoods to get a trigger off of Beanstalk for just 3 mana, impending the creature and ramping yourself, as well as Pillage the Bog as basically a tutor when you want to getting all these additional lands from your Overlord of the Hauntwoods. It still had Golgari Midrange mainstays in Glissa, Sheoldred, and a Harvester of Misery, as well as plenty of removal spells to try to deal with all of the aggro decks that were predicted to be in the room. However, aside from Seth Manfield, the rest of the team didn't do too hot. 5 players altogether resulted in a 40.9% win rate for this D-tier popularity deck, with a lot of those wins coming from Seth himself. Now, the other flavor of Demon's deck is something we saw in Pioneer a little bit more recently in Mono Black, but this one was Dimir. It did wind up also making the top 8, so that didn't get confusing at all. This one, however, utilized the combo of Unholy Annex, Unstoppable Slasher, and Bloodletter of Aclazotz to rely on closing out its games. If you're unfamiliar with the interaction, the Bloodletter of Aclazotz will basically double the damage that gets dealt. So if you land a Slasher on 3, a Bloodletter on 4, and they can't block your Unstoppable Slasher, that's GG because it deals all of their life total and damage. Now, the Unholy Annex Ritual Chamber not only gives you a demon if you're able to open the second half of the door, but by having a Bloodletter of Aclazotz in play, which is a demon, it triggers the drain effect, so you'll gain 2, but they'll lose 4. So this makes your Phyrexian Arena a 5-turn clock, as long as you've done no other damage, which is difficult when you have Archfiend of the Dross and plenty of removal spells in your deck to kind of clear the way. Now, this version of the Dimir Demons deck did not do as hot as Handshake's, only massing a 36.8% win rate across the 3 pilots that brought this flavor of demons to the room. The mono white Caretaker's Talent deck looked to utilize Caretaker's Talent, its namesake card, and a bunch of different ways to make tokens to get yourself some card advantage, and then eventually turn things into anthems and just make your tiny little tokens game-ending threats. It did wind up getting some upgrades in Enduring Innocence from Duskmourn, so whenever you're making one of those small tokens, not only do you get the card draw from Caretaker's Talent, but you do get it from Enduring Innocence as well. Beza the Bounding Spring was a very key part of this deck, as it did slow things down and would not play like an aggro deck, but more of a mid-range or control deck, and Beza was your catch-up mechanic against a lot of the other aggro decks that you saw in the room, in addition to running a full package of laydown arms because you have 14 planes and 4 Sunfall on your side. The mono white Caretakers list also did not have the best tournament, packing a 35.7% win rate, which is the worst out of all of the decks in the room with at least 2 or more copies to it. The Orzhov version of the Demons list was probably one of the more straight up mid-range decks and almost entirely mono black in the main deck, save for a couple of copies of Legions to Ashes, which would be able to target a creature and then remove all token copies, which would be pretty good if you were anticipating a lot of those Caretaker's Talent-esque decks. It did rely on the same demon package of Unholy Annex, Bloodletter of Aclazotz, and then the Unstoppable Slasher to really finish games, but played a little bit slower with copies of Cruel Cause Heist, a lot of removal spells, and main deck Liliana of the Veils. So if you're more of a mono black mid-range style player, this might be the deck to look at if you're looking to splash some extra removal and temporary lockdowns in the side. Now, there are only 2 pilots that played this deck to a 50% win rate overall, so the jury's out on if this is a better version of Demons than the rest of them, or if it goes to be too slow for a metagame that may be doing combo Otter things in the future. Boros Enchantments played like a Boros Heroic deck in other formats, taking the same powerful red shell of the Mice and Slickshot Show-Off package, but pairing it with a little bit of eerie synergies in Optimistic Scavenger, some protection spells in Skrelv Defector Might, and just the powerful Aura's Matter package that came into play with Duskmourn. Ethereal Armor being powered up by all your other enchantments that you have, such as Shard Mage's Rescue, Sheltered by Ghosts, and a couple of copies of Demonic Ruckus to give your creatures a little bit of extra menace and trample side of things. The Boros Enchantments deck, or this heroic style deck, had a 50% win rate overall, but only 2 pilots in the room, so this D tier popularity deck might not be the go-to choice of aggro, but maybe your favorite style again if you like that heroic gameplay. Now I'm just going to highlight the best deck out of the ones that only had a singleton copy in the room, because it was actually the best performing deck in all of Standard, going undefeated in the Swiss portion. Quintanel's mono red aggro deck changed the core package of the red X aggro decks that we saw elsewhere in the tournament by opting not to run Slickshot Show-Off at all. It still did wind up utilizing the mouse package and therefore ran 4 full copies of Rockface Village, but also added in a couple of lizards like Hired Claw to ping your opponent. It also utilized Screaming Nemesis, a 3/3 haster from Duskmourn, to not only have a bit of a Boros Reckoner style effect, but also prevent life gain from their opponents. This, backed up by a package of more burn related spells as opposed to just specific pump spells, made this deck a little bit different and just slightly strange enough that the way that you prepped against the other aggro decks didn't necessarily affect this one. So even though it was a D tier popularity deck with just that 1 copy in the room, Quinn had an 87.5% win rate overall, not dropping a match until the semifinals. Now that we have an idea of what made each individual archetype tick, let's take a look at the top presence decks from Worlds, which is what I'm basically calling every single deck in the room that had at least 3 or more copies. So yes, some of the archetypes we went over just previously are not going to be mentioned in this matchup matrix. However, I just think that going over each and every one individually when they're only one deck in the room doesn't really give you a comprehensive look at the data. And even some of these decks that only have 3 lists don't have matches against every single deck on this list, which means that it's debatable if this data is actually super relevant to them as well. However, I did want to cover just as many archetypes as possible, since I do want to showcase the fact that Standard is wide open at this point and looks like a lot of fun. So if you see a deck on this list and it winds up having some head-to-head matchups against the other popular decks in the room, that's awesome data that you can take to your LGS and start thinking about for your own homebrew sideboard guides. Gruul Prowess was the most represented deck in the room and had a target on its back, but it still wound up doing pretty good against the top decks in the field. It wound up wrecking the Otters deck that was, I guess, just too fast for it to handle and couldn't combo off safely enough with enough life left over to actually win the game, and did pretty well into the regular version of the Dimir Demons and the mono-white Caretakers decks, and even the Dimir Midrange and Domain Ramp decks. The only decks it really struggled against, and by struggled I mean had a sub 50% win rate against, were the popular Azorius Oculus deck, which does go pretty big pretty fast, and the Handshake Demons deck, which was packing a little bit more removal and slightly less creatures. Then there was also the Jeskai Convoke deck, where again, if the deck was slightly faster than what the Gruul Prowess deck could do, it wound up having a positive win rate against it at this small tournament. The normal Dimir Midrange deck really found its groove against the Domain Ramp and, well, the opposing Handshake Demons deck, and decks that just needed a little bit more time to set up, like Golgari Ramp and the mono-white Caretakers pack. This of course comes with a sideboard plan that has access to blue cards, so not only do you wind up having the black hand disruption and the blue side getting counter magic, but you have a good clock in the fact that you had all this card advantage from a 4/3 Enduring Curiosity on your side of the board as well. Now, even though it was a very powerful mid-range deck that had angles to close the game, doesn't mean it was impervious to other decks. It struggled against the Gruul Prowess deck, which is a little bit faster, as well as the Azorius Oculus deck, when the Dimir Midrange deck wasn't packing ley lines or specific graveyard hate against that kind of deck. It also very much so struggled against the Temur Prowess Otters combo deck, although how much of that is going into the deck blind and not knowing what the deck does versus it just being a straight up poor matchup, we'll have to see as the metagame evolves. Azorius Oculus, very powerful breakout deck of the tournament in my opinion, had a pretty solid matchup spread against all the other decks in the room. Now, while it didn't play against the normal version of the Dimir Demons deck, it did have a positive win rate against the Handshake version of the deck, and even though it struggled against the mono-white Caretakers deck, which may have been one of the only decks running Rest in Peace in the room, go figure, it also did not put up great results against the normal Golgari Midrange deck that could probably just go very 1-for-1 with a lot of the threats that it was presenting, even though it was a little bit fast with some of its early graveyard shenanigans starts. But against the rest of the field, this deck slapped with an above 50% win rate against just about everything else. So if you are going into an LGS meta and you are not playing the Oculus deck, you probably want to pack something to deal with opposing graveyards, because this deck should be out in droves. A deck that was hated last version of Standard actually got its comeuppance in this event here at Worlds. The Domain Ramp deck struggled to find success against any of the top decks in the room, and by top decks I mean most played decks. 33.3% win rate against Gruul Prowess, 16.7% against the normal Dimir Midrange deck, and 25% win rate against the Azorius Oculus deck meant that this deck kind of got beat up by the most present decks in the room. Now, it did have an okay performance against the Golgari version of the mid-range decks, as well as a normal 100% performance against the Jeskai Convoke and Golgari Ramp decks, despite a very small sample size. But the Domain Ramp deck, even with Overlord of the Hauntwoods being injected into the format to give that namesake domain faster, seemed to really struggle to find its footing in a format that was relatively unknown, with a couple of decks popping up that you wouldn't be able to have a big plan or sideboard plan against, like the Oculus and the Prowess deck. Now, the more normal version of Golgari Midrange wound up sporting a very favorable matchup against the Azorius Oculus deck, thanks to a lot of main deck ways to deal with their main game plan forever. Dreams of Steel and Oil, Tranquil Frillback, and Anoint with Affliction are all ways to exile graveyards or exile the low mana threats entirely, while we still had copies of Terra Sunder the Exile and Ghost Vacuum in the sideboard of this deck. It also had a very good matchup against the low to the ground aggro decks, such as the Gruul Prowess deck, because of just the sheer amount of removal that it was packing. It did have a very favorable matchup against the Dimir Prowess combo deck, thanks to the same package of removal and interaction, although it did not play nearly as many games as it did against the other aggro decks. The combination of Archfiend of the Dross and the card advantage that Caustic Bronco and Mosswood Dread Knight are giving this deck, in addition to being able to run Glissa Sunslayer, means that this mid-range Golgari deck looks to recapture some of the former glory this Golgari list had in just recent standard past. Alright, now the Temur Prowess Otters combo, I'm sure everybody's really interested in how it did against the field, and unfortunately it wasn't the greatest overall. It played 9 matches against the Azorius Oculus and Gruul Prowess decks, which were just too powerful or too fast for the deck to kind of clearly combo off, and it did also struggle against some of the more mid-range decks like the Golgari Midrange and the Handshake version of the Demons deck, having a 33.3% win rate against those decks specifically. But some of the decks that weren't packing just straight player removal in turning things sideways or way too much creature removal, it did do pretty decent against, like the Dimir version of the mid-range deck that just didn't have the right package of interaction to deal with its combo, giving it an 85.7% win rate overall against that deck. Now some of the slower decks like the normal Dimir Demons and the mono white Caretakers deck, this deck is a combo deck. It's going to go fast. It's going to beat up on those decks before they can kind of set themselves up and get them in a good spot to be. So if you're in a mid-range matters meta, the Temur Prowess Otter combo might be the way to go. Alright, so the Team Handshake Demons deck won the event, so very clearly it's the best deck in the format, right? Well, yes and no. It was pretty darn good against Gruul Prowess and was pretty much tuned to do so, so a 57.1% win rate there is really solid, but it did not do that great against the normal Dimir midrange decks or the Azorius Oculus list, which were the other top presence decks in the room. Now, it did wind up doing pretty decently against Domain Ramp, Golgari Midrange, even the Otter Prowess combo deck, and some of the other slower decks like the Mono White Caretakers list, but it did struggle against Jeskai Convoke, and the normal Dimir Demons actually had its number. So if you wind up having a deck that is a little bit faster than this deck can mill you out with its Demon combo, and it is draining itself for more damage since it's running technically less Demons than the other deck with its Unholy Annex, you can get underneath it and beat it before it can mill you out. Now, speaking of one of those decks that could get underneath ones, Jeskai Convoke had a okay showing, but there weren't a lot of matches against some of the less represented decks in the room. So what we're really going to focus on is how it does against the top presence decks in the room, which is not that bad. 60% against Gruul Prowess, 50% against Dimir Midrange, but unfortunately only 25% against the Azorius Oculus lists. This deck can kind of go toe-to-toe against some of the normal style decks that aren't really cheating too many things onto the battlefield early, but if the Azorius Oculus deck stays as popular as I think it's going to, the Convoke deck may have to change around its removal package or maybe even put in some graveyard hate to slow itself down in order to combat a 5/5 flyer hitting the battlefield on potentially turn 2. So Seth Manfield's Golgari Ramp deck did great in his hands as he went 6-1 overall with the list, but the rest of Team Channel Fireball did not do too hot. Now, we don't have a ton of games played here as we are getting to that portion of our metagame analysis where there are just less decks in the room, but only 50% win rate against Gruul Prowess and then 25% win rate against Oculus and Dimir Midrange, the other two popular decks in the room, makes me think that this deck needs to find the right combination of interaction and smaller creatures potentially to make it kind of get that extra level of oomph. Now, this deck did have a slightly better performance than Domain Ramp overall, so maybe tuning your Domain Ramp deck to look more like the Golgari Ramp deck might be where you find the happy medium between these two, but it might just be a non-ramp meta with the way that the decks are shaking out.
Bloodletter of Akhlazot's Dimir Demons did not have the same amount of games nor the same performance as its Team Handshake counterpart, but did wind up having a 50% win rate against the normal Dimir midrange list. It did not actually go head-to-head with the Azorius Oculus deck at all at Worlds, which is where I think this deck could really be the make or break compared to the Handshake Demons list. If this one does better into the Oculus deck, that may be the one that we want to look at playing going forward, especially when the Handshake list is milling a deck that wants things in its graveyard sometimes. Lastly, rounding out the top presence decks at Worlds, we have the mono white Caretaker's Talent deck, which again was very polarizing and kind of hit or miss. Now, while it didn't have the most matches in the room against some of these decks here at Worlds, it did have a 0% win rate against Dimir Midrange and a 33.3% win rate against Gruul Prowess, which means if your deck is not looking to combat one of these top two decks in the room, it's probably not where you want to be. Now, it did have a 100% win rate against the Azorius Oculus deck, and as I mentioned, this is one of the decks in the room that could probably run Rest in Peace uninhibited, so that would wind up giving it a favorable matchup into Oculus if you expect to see that a lot at your LGS.
So that's how Standard wound up shaking out at Magic Worlds this past year. So what do you think? Are you on board with the Standard hype train like I am and looking forward to slinging some spells in Standard sleeves? Or are you kind of on the downturn and still looking to feel out what it is you want to play? Do you have an idea already? Or has this video kind of helped you go through your thought process on what Standard has to offer? You can let me know down in the comments below what you're looking forward to playing or what you don't want to play against this Standard season. And of course, while you're down there, you can give the video a thumbs up so you can let the YouTube algorithm know that you like Standard as much as I enjoy Pioneer and am looking forward to the Standard season this upcoming RCQ season. I, of course, want to give a quick shout out to all of my supporters as well. Thank you for showing your devotion to the channel, and if you want to be here on this list alongside them, get access to members' first debuts of videos, members only content, and an invite to the Discord server. You can bug me all times of the day about the kinds of cards and decks you're looking to put together, maybe even get your own deck tech. You can click that join button below the video or over on my YouTube channel to learn how you can become a member. And thank you so much for the support that you give me. Now, as always, you can also tap that subscribe button to stay up to date on all sorts of deck techs, metagame analysis, and just in general, Magic content I'll be putting out. See you in Standard.